Last week, while the world focused on Trump wanting to buy Greenland, other headlines, well, they got pushed out of the way, including some major but quiet developments when it comes to immigration. Now, for example, the administration very quietly announced that it wants to end the rule that limits how long the government can hold undocumented children. Right now, the limit's 20 days. The new rule could make that indefinite. The rule would also allow kids to be held by private contractors and not just by the U.S. government. Now, this all is despite the fact that the Inspector General's office found overcrowding in migrant holding facilities along with inadequate medical care, unreported safety incidents, food safety issues, even nooses in detainee cells. Now, DHS also announced it would not provide flu shots for detainees, putting the health of detainees at risk. The ACLU, they filed suit against Louisiana sheriff who detained a U.S. citizen for 4 days despite having a valid passport, driver's license, social security card. Sheriff's office explained it now detains, quote, all suspected Latino people for immigration reviews. And on Thursday, reports surfaced that the Justice Department sent emails with links to white supremacist threats, can't make this up, to the very judges the white supremacists were in fact threatening. So for more on what all of that says about our immigration policies and where we are, and also about the Trump administration's culture when it comes to immigration and related issues, let's bring in Sofia Tesfaye. She is a deputy politics editor for Salon, and she also writes frequently about immigration. Sofia, thank you as always for a few. I appreciate it.
Thanks.
You know, people probably hadn't heard of the Flores settlement agreement, but basically what it did was it put some basic standards on how we treated primarily immigrant kids. And to consciously say, even though they're overcrowded, we don't have enough judges, all these problems exist, we're going to now keep this population longer with arguably less supervision with all the problems we have. At the end of the day, without overcomplicating, this is really about inflicting pain and sending a message. It's not more complicated than that, is it?
No, actually, it's not. I think you got that spot on. The Trump administration has long sought to change the Flores settlement agreement because they see it as being too favorable to immigrants that have come to the border, either seeking asylum or, without proper papers and proper passage. And so I think from the perspective of the Trump administration, this is a settlement agreement that, comes from courts, which is not a pathway of policy making that has been respected very much by this administration to begin with. And so they see it as a barrier to inflicting the pain that you just referred to.
You know, Sofia, a lot of times people see numbers, they'll hear an isolated story, but one story that jumped out, and I know you covered it, is you had a guy who, to my knowledge, had never even set foot in Iraq, and he was born in a refugee camp in Greece, that was sent back to Iraq, even though he was in the U.S. since he was 6 months old, didn't speak a word of Iraqi, and died homeless and without insulin. He was diabetic. And the idea that nobody could have foreseen something like this happening, yet we still went ahead and did it, I think it speaks volumes for the dysfunction that we're looking at right now.
I think dysfunction would be probably a favorable way of looking at this. I think a lot of this is very much deliberate. That gentleman, I believe his first name was Jimmy. I can't off the top of my head recall his last name. He did die in Iraq, but he was part of a community in the Michigan area, I think outside of Detroit, that does have a large population of Iraqi expats who do live in the U.S. And so this community has been specifically targeted. And if you look at the record of the Trump administration, which communities they do target, there are specific immigrants who have overstayed their visas, who are being targeted, and specific immigrant groups who are not. One such group is like in Boston, in the Massachusetts area. Irish immigrants have not been targeted as greatly for deportation as, for instance, Latino immigrants and immigrants from the Middle East or Africa. And I do think that there's a specific political bent to that kind of immigration enforcement. It's not just a matter of dysfunction. It's very deliberate. If you look at even policy, not just on deportation, but policy on who's allowed to come into the U.S. The U.S. used to have a pretty generous policy of allowing interpreters from Iraq. But under the Trump administration, the numbers of Iraqi interpreters allowed into the U.S. have dramatically fallen. I believe there is a new report out that shows only about 2 have been actually let into the country. And so it's not race neutral. It's not ethnicity neutral or region neutral. It's very much targeted. And I think we should be cognizant of that because there is a political purpose to all of this.
And it should be noted, those translators, they risked their lives helping the American military presence there. And they were talking about looking at death sentences for cooperating with the U.S. if they were left behind. We all saw the Mississippi raids of that plant. But the part that people didn't see was less than 24 hours, more than half these people were released, sometimes hours away from where they were picked up. They consciously did it in many cases on the first day of school, etc. Again, a lot of this is to play for the cameras because a lot of this is about 2020. The administration sees this as a winning political issue for them. What I'm wondering is, Sofia, if they're doing it now and we're in August of 19, there's no reason to think this is not going to get a lot uglier, not just the rhetoric, but the actions between now and next fall.
I think you're completely right about how this kind of egregious enforcement will be probably ramped up in the lead up to the election. And I do think a lot of that is also tied to the president's perspective on his reelection chances. Unfortunately, I think if he kind of sees himself as not having necessarily the best economy, then he will rely on these more base instincts that initially got him the GOP nomination, which are fear-mongering, race-based fear-mongering of immigrants. Most notably with that Mississippi raid, none of the employers who hired these undocumented immigrants who were eventually then released, as you noted, none of those employers have yet to be held accountable for their illegal activity, which is hiring undocumented workers. And secondly, when there was a job fair held a couple of days after these raids, very, very few of the 700 positions were then filled by local Mississippians. So for all intents and purposes, appears to be just a race-based arresting.
Yeah, between the optics and the reality, as we've seen throughout this, is a huge gap. Sofia Tesfaye, I really appreciate the time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, coming up next, we switch gears. Ever imagine what your retirement day would look like? Now, imagine people you've never met in your life before telling you your retirement is really just you wimping out. Essentially, that's what happened to Colts quarterback Andrew Luck, and it wasn't just fans who booed him in Indianapolis. We'll get into that and more straight ahead.